We're going to look at a prominent biblical character who, through the struggles and trials in his life, went from an unconverted state to being a converted person who's going to eventually reap eternal life. And he was a man who knew about God, and as he began his journey along the path to salvation, he did not truly know God. And through the struggles in his life, he came to understand things a lot better about God's point of view. And he was asking questions, seeking to know God and what God's purpose was for him, and where he he had areas to grow. He began to understand those things. And as he went to God and spoke to God, then God did give him the answers that he needed. And there is a problem. We have certain things in our mind about the way things ought to be, and as a result, when it doesn't happen, we struggle. You know, we want certain things and certain outcomes, but they don't always go the way we want them to go. We don't expect the answers that God has, because God's answer may be different from what we want. And because we try to get God to give us the answers that we want him to give, that's not how God works. We may say, well, God, this is the answer I want, and God may say, I'm not going to give you that answer. And things may work out totally differently than we may expect. And we can always expect that God will give us the truth, even if we don't want to hear it. He will give us the truth. He will want to move us from where we are to where he is and where he wants us to be. So he deals with us in his way because he can see the whole playing field and see everything that's involved. And so God will do his part, but we have to understand what we have, that we have our part to do also. So with these initial thoughts in mind, we're going to examine the life of a man who was moved from where he was, which was being unconverted, to being converted. And this movement, the process of conversion, is reflected in the title of my sermon, which is From Jacob to Israel. As you look at Jacob, Jacob was one whom God would call and extend to him the blessings of Abraham. And let's begin by taking a look at some aspects of Jacob's story. Let's go to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25. And this is the circumstance of Jacob's birth. Let's begin in chapter 25, verse 20. It says, Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived. So they had gone a long time in their marriage without having a child, and she wanted to have a child, he wanted to have a child. And so she conceived and was pregnant. Verse 22 says, but the children struggled together within her. And she said, if all is well, why am I like this? Why do I have this struggle going on, it seems, between the two children in my womb? So she went to inquire of the Lord, what's going on? And what did God tell her in verse 23? He said, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So he's telling her that something very important is going to take place with the birth of these 2 children. One is going to dominate the other. And unusually, the younger is going to serve the younger is going to be dominant over the younger. The older will serve the younger. Verse 24, so when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. Twins. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, and so they called his name Esau. They called his name Esau. So he was red is associated with Esau, and as we'll see, red is going to play an important part in his life a little bit later on. And verse 26 says, afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. which means supplanter. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So he was 40 when he married Rebekah, and he's 60 when the boys are born. And Jacob's name is supplanter. So what does that mean? Because it is significant. The younger is named Jacob, or heel holder, to hold the heel, and it means to outwit. And this is from the Kyle and DeLitch commentary. Just as in wrestling, an attempt may be made to throw the opponent by grasping the heel. So Jacob was going to be in contention with someone somewhere for mastery of life. That's the way he was going to be. He was going to be in contention with other people for the mastery of life. And the purpose of grabbing the heel was to trip someone up. And he did that throughout his life. And he may not have tripped up Esau right away, but eventually he did. And as I said, this term, supplanter, can also mean wrestler, because it's involved with wrestling and grabbing the heel and tipping the other person over. So you might say Jacob is not only a supplanter, but the wrestler. And as we'll see, by the time we come to the end of the story, wrestling is a very important part of what takes place. So as you think about Esau versus Jacob, you would think Esau would be the one who's the wrestler, but that's not the case. Esau had a certain way about him, and it looks like he would have been the wrestler, but Jacob had that characteristic, and it was very much a part of his nature. As you look at the story, Esau was a hunter. He loved the outdoors, and Jacob was more of a mild man. He wasn't so much of an outdoorsman. But we find that he was rather aggressive in some of his ways. He was a pretty shrewd person. So if he came into contact with you, he would size you up. And he would figure out, okay, I can take advantage of this person in this way. He was pretty shrewd, and that's the way he operated. Isaac loved Esau because of his hunting skills. He loved the outdoors and the food that would be prepared from the game that he would bring home from hunting. And Rebekah loved Jacob. And when you see that, you see an automatic problem in the household, because Isaac loved Esau, Rebekah loves Jacob, and that's an area of conflict. So they were not in total harmony in dealing with their children. It was a divided house, and a divided house is a problem. It so happened that this division was going to work out in such a way that God's will was going to be done in terms of who was going to receive the blessing and the birthright. And this one dominating the other is going to be played out in their lives. Let's go to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis 25, verse 29. It says, "Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary." So as you think about this, was Jacob way out from the camp? He's out in the wilderness, and there's no access to the camp? I don't think that's the case at all. I think he's within a reasonable distance of the camp. And so here comes Esau in, and Jacob is making this lentil stew. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with the same red stew, for I am weary." So he was hungry. He wanted this red stew, and that's why his name became Edom. He was known as Esau and Edom, and Edom means red. But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." So he just went straight to it. Sell me your birthright. So he knew the prophecy that he was to prevail over his brother. So he just went right to it, and no questions asked, and just straightforwardly asked, "Sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die, so what is this birthright to me?" So Esau says, "Fine, what's the big deal? What's the birthright to me?" And I doubt he was going to die. Maybe he was awfully hungry, but he didn't value the birthright. Then Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. So Jacob, in asking for the birthright, was no doubt aware of the prophecy. And so the prophecy is going to work out according to God's timing and the way God wants it to work out. And as you look at the facts on the ground, there's no way that, Esau is the older, and he should get the blessing and the birthright. That was his right by being firstborn. Now, Isaac could change that. He could make a decision, I'm going to have Jacob be the one who receives the birthright and the blessing. He could make that decision as the patriarch of the family. But, he liked Esau, so I doubt that was going to happen. I don't think he was going to change his mind. So Esau is the one who's going to inherit both the birthright and the blessing. But it doesn't change the fact that there was a prophecy that the older would serve the younger. Now, could God work that out? Absolutely. Was it necessary for Jacob to take matters into his own hands? Absolutely not. But that's how Jacob saw it. So Jacob, being a quiet man, he was not going to usurp his father's authority directly. But if he could get Esau to sell him his birthright, he was more than willing to take advantage of that opportunity. He was a shrewd individual, and he took advantage of his brother when he was hungry. So Esau didn't value it. He figured, I'm the firstborn, I'm going to inherit this, and I don't have to worry about it. In the case of Jacob, it was of far greater significance to be the heir of the promised blessing. And he had a vision of what this meant. And so he took advantage of his brother because he realized what the blessing of the birthright would mean to him. Whereas Esau figured, I'm going to inherit it anyway, who cares? He wasn't worried about it. Whereas Jacob saw it as something valuable, something worth obtaining. Because he knew that there would be immediate benefits and that there would be blessings that would come his way, being a descendant of Abraham. So knowing all of this, Jacob is willing to purchase the birthright. He's willing to purchase the birthright. He's the type of man that he is. He would do it in a peaceful way. He didn't kill his brother. He saw an opportunity and he took it to bring about supremacy over his brother Esau. And so Esau sells him the birthright. And as you think about Esau, Esau didn't value it. Basically, he didn't value it at all. What does it mean to me? He didn't have the vision of how significant it was. And Jacob saw beyond what Esau saw. So the next incident that comes up is the passing of the blessing. We're not going to read the story. We'll just go through the highlights. And as you think about this is an amazing story that most of us are familiar with. Jacob again takes matters into his own hands. He takes matters into his own hands by deceiving his father, by impersonating Esau, and by lying about it. And he and his mother, Rebekah, are in cahoots in taking advantage of Isaac's blindness. She came up with a plan for Jacob to receive the blessing. Jacob was her favorite, and she knew the prophecy. She wanted her son to have not only the birthright, but the blessing. And she must have thought this through in order to work it out. And so she joined with Jacob in effecting this. To receive the blessing, it would include the birthright. And neither of them seemed to have any reluctance about carrying out this plan. And Jacob is here showing a characteristic that he's going to put on display a number of different times. He's going to work things out his own way. So he would come up on a situation and he would size up the opportunity and say, I'm going to take advantage of this because this is going to give me more or work out for me in a positive way. So he would work things out in the way he wanted, without trusting God, without consulting God, using his own wits, and going to do things using his own strength and reasoning in order to get his own way. Now, as you go into the New Testament, the Apostle Paul called Esau a profane person. And he became a bitter person, filled with hatred for his brother because of what took place here with the blessing. And as you look at Jacob, Jacob had his issues, which God is going to work with him on. And he's going to have to resolve some of these issues of using his own wits and his own reasoning and scheming to get the better of others. And that was a common part of his life. So what was the first consequence of this decision to deceive Isaac and take the blessing? The first consequence was that Esau said, he was just extremely disappointed. He wanted that blessing from his father, and his father said, I can't give you the blessing. There's only one to give. He did pray to God for Esau, but there was only one blessing. So he was angry. And he said, you know what? He's taken advantage of me, but that's not going to last, because when my father dies, I'm going to kill him. I'll just bide my time, and I'm going to kill Jacob when I have the opportunity. And as you think about this, neither Rebekah or Jacob seem to have recognized, if I do this, this may make some people unhappy, especially Esau. So it didn't cross their mind, and they went ahead and did it. And I think they were a little bit surprised. Wow, what are you so upset about? Well, if you realize the value of the blessing, you would be upset too. But they just didn't seem to see that. So Isaac saw the threat. He saw that Esau was mad. He wants to kill Jacob. So what does Esau come up with as a solution? He says, you need to get out of town. You need to leave, because he knows Esau wants to kill Jacob. And he tells him, go to Laban, your mother's brother, and you can stay there for a while. And he wanted him to get a wife from the area where his wife was from. He did not want his son Jacob to marry a Canaanite. Esau had married a Canaanite, and as you go through the story, you find out they were unhappy about Esau marrying a Canaanite. It created some difficulties in the family. And he said, I don't want Jacob to marry a Canaanite. So, and as you think about Isaac asking Jacob to leave, Isaac may have been beginning to get a glimpse of the way Esau was, and to begin to see that maybe Esau was not the best person to receive the birthright and the blessing. Maybe it was better that Jacob receive it. And, he wasn't, it had already been worked out, but he was able to see where that may, in the long run, may have been a better outcome. So he sends Jacob away, and he leaves Esau back at home with him. And it was but as Jacob left, it was in his mind to come back. So Jacob begins his journey, and the first night out, he's in a place that is later called Bethel. And God speaks to him in a dream, and God brings up the main issue. And God tells him at that time, he says, this is where you ought to be, Jacob. This is the land that I promised to Abraham and Isaac, and to you and to your descendants. So gave it to Abraham, I gave it to Isaac, and I want to pass this along to you as well. And he says to him, he says, you need to keep that in mind. I will be with you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to the land. So I'm going to work this out. I'm going to be with you because I'm going to give this blessing to you. And he wasn't putting his stamp of approval on everything that Jacob did. He was simply saying, this is what I promised to do, and I am going to do it. So let's go to chapter 28 and look at verse 18. Chapter 28, verse 18. It says, then Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put at his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. So, verse 19, and he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city had been Luz previously. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me. So, he's saying, if God will be with me. He didn't have confidence that God would be with me. He said, if God will be with me. So, God, if you come through and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. So you begin to wonder, was God his God at this point? He's not a converted person at this time. And so he says, well, if you do these things for me, and I come back to this land, to my father's house in peace, then you shall be my God. And give me bread to eat and clothing to put on. So he's more or less saying, here are the stipulations, God. And, God could have said, you're kind of arrogant. I'm done with you. But that's not how God deals with us, thankfully. So he doesn't have a converted mind at this time at all. But look at chapter 28, verse 13. Chapter 28, verse 13. It says, and behold, the Lord stood above it, and this is looking at the ladder that he had in a dream. It says, I am the Lord God of Abraham and your father, and the God, Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. But whose God is he? God says the God of Abraham and Isaac. God knew he was not Jacob's God at this point. Not that Jacob did not believe in him, but he wasn't the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at this juncture in the story. So he's making a deal with God. Remember, he's shrewd. And he's even willing to make deals with God. God says, okay, but this isn't the end of the story. There's going to be a lot more to it than that. And later on, in the time of Moses, he was sent by God to Israel and told them that he represented the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, your fathers. That's what he said to Moses. So when you go, Moses, and speak to Israel, you tell them that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has spoken to you. By that time, things were clarified. So this God was going to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that was not the case as Jacob left the land of Canaan. So Jacob leaves, and he goes up to the area of Haran and meets the daughters of Laban and begins to dwell with them. And as Jacob arrived in that area and met Laban's daughters, Laban didn't have any sons. He had no sons, he only had daughters, and as a result of not having any sons, he had no official heir. So when Jacob shows up, Laban is elated because here I have somebody that can marry my daughter and can be my heir. And so Jacob thought, pretty good deal. I get the girl, I get the birthright and the blessing. It's all good. It's all going to work out for me. So as Jacob enters into the bargain here for Rachel, he thinks he's going to get Rachel at the end of 7 years. And, Jacob thought he was a pretty shrewd individual. But he met somebody here in Laban who is much more shrewd than he was. So they made the deal that Jacob would work 7 years for Rachel, and it says that he worked for Rachel, and time passed quickly. So he ends up with not Rachel, but Leah. I can't imagine waking up, not realizing I've got the wrong girl. But I don't know. He must have really slept well and didn't know what was going on. But anyway, that's hard to comprehend, but that's what happened. And so he had been tricked by Laban. So he had tricked his father, and it's just, his just desert in a way that he was tricked by Laban. So he's going to have to work another 7 years for Rachel. So and Laban, in the meantime, as he's working for him, is benefiting. He's getting richer every year that Jacob works for him. Jacob then relies upon his wits and again to make a deal with Laban to acquire property for himself. And Jacob began to prosper, and Laban still does okay. But Jacob does a lot better than Laban. Prior to this deal being made, Jacob just received wages. And Jacob changed the wages multiple times. There was not a lot Jacob could do about it because Laban is the patriarch here. He controls the whole situation. He owns Jacob, he owns the wives, he owns everything that you could say was Jacob's. He owns it all. But he says, well, I've got the girls, I am the heir, and things seem to be working out for him, at least up to a certain point. When things go bad in the relationship, Jacob has to work out his own deal for his own property. He asked Laban to give him all the speckled and colored animals, and you take the white ones. And Laban says, fine. Because I think in Laban's mind, the white ones were the most common. Speckled and colored weren't common. But if you breed properly, you get more speckled and colored ones, which is exactly what happened with the animals. And so Jacob began to prosper, and his flock begins to grow. And when he made the deal with Laban about getting the white ones, and Jacob would get the speckled and colored ones, Laban says, fine, I'll go for that, fully expecting, I'm going to get the better end of this deal. But you're dealing with one shrewd character out-shrewding the other. So Jacob is, as you look at Jacob, he's stuck. He's stuck. He's in a situation where the property that he begins to accumulate, his wives, and everything belongs to his father-in-law, Laban. So what does Jacob do? He takes matters into his own hands. He does exactly what he does all the time. He takes matters into his own hands. He's once again deceitful. He doesn't go directly to Laban and say, you know what, it's time that we would leave, and can we leave? Would you honor our request? What does he do? He sneaks off. He tells his wives, we're out of here, and his wives agree. We have nothing here. They realize that Jacob was not going to inherit, so you're right, we need to go. And so Jacob packs them up while Laban is away shearing the sheep, and the reason that they're leaving is Jacob is no longer the heir. Laban has sons. I don't need you anymore. So we're leaving. And so they sneak away, and eventually Laban comes back from shearing the sheep and realizes that Jacob and his daughters and everything that they own, they're gone. So he saddles up and goes after Jacob. And he's angry and upset and out for blood. And he catches up with Jacob, and Laban has been settled down to a degree because God gave him a dream, and he said, don't do anything to Jacob. It didn't totally make him happy, but he knew, I can't kill Jacob, which is what I want to do. So you see a couple of times here, Jacob was the kind of individual that would upset people, and they would be more than happy to take his life. You've pulled one over one too many times on me, and it's time for you to die. But God intervenes and stops that. So they talk, and they eventually come to an agreement. Basically, they set up these stones which designate, you won't come back this way, and I won't come beyond it, and we'll go on with our respective lives. So they come to an agreement, and Laban releases Jacob and his wives, and they move on toward the promised land. So Jacob once again is on his way, but barely. And there is a complete break with that part of his life where he had lived with Laban, and now he moves on. He's now going back to the land that was promised to him, where God told him he was to be. And there's only one problem as he's going back to the land. See, we think, and it's a good illustration of the fact, sometimes we think we can avoid issues. I don't want to deal with this. I'm moving on. And as you come, eventually things bring you back to that area, and you have no choice but to deal with it. And that's exactly where Jacob finds himself. So he comes back, to the land of promise, Esau is still around. And he knows he's going to have to deal with Esau. He knows what God says, and this is the land I'm passing along to you as a result of the promises to Abraham and Isaac. But he knows his brother hates him, and when he left home, Esau was intent on killing him. And so he knows he's going to have to face Esau, and he hopes that Esau has had a change of heart, that there's not going to be a confrontation. So for the first time in his life, this is a situation he can't control. He can't control it. He's going to have to deal with it, and he's going to have to ask for God's intervention in the situation to give Esau a different heart. He's going to have to face Esau, and he knows this situation is out of his hands. It's in God's hands. And Jacob returns to the land where he grew up and close to where Esau had moved. And an interesting part of the story is this: Isaac began to see Esau and to know what Esau was like. And he knew that it was not wise that Esau and Jacob would live together. And if Jacob was to come back, that was going to present a difficulty. So Isaac knew that he had to send Esau away if Jacob was going to come back and inherit the promises. So Abraham had already done this when he sent away Ishmael, and he sent away the sons of Keturah as well. Because when Isaac was born, he knew that Isaac was not going to dwell peacefully with those other family members. So he said, you guys need to go your own way. And here we have Esau not living in Canaan. Where had he gone? He had gone far to the south to Mount Seir. And which is a rough part of the country, so you have a rough person living in a rough part of the land. And in his time in Mount Seir, he's acquired wives from Canaan, Egypt, and from the Ishmaelites. And he's built a clan for himself. He has children and he has grandchildren. And he also has 400 armed men who are part of his household. And Esau is a man who lives by the sword. And here he comes to meet his brother Jacob. Jacob is going to have to deal with this. So in Genesis chapter 32, we come to the confrontation. Let's begin in chapter 32 and look at verse 1. So Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. So if you remember back to when Jacob was leaving the land where his father and mother dwelled, he encountered angels then. These angels going up and down what's called Jacob's ladder. So the angels meet him, and then verse 2, when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. And he called the name of the place Mahanaim. And so God is giving Jacob reassurance that he's doing the right thing. Just keep going. It's all going to be okay. And it reassured him that God wasn't leaving him, but there was going to be a closer encounter that was to come. This wasn't the final encounter. Jacob doesn't know it, but he is going to encounter God in a more direct way, as we'll see. So he crosses over the Jordan and comes to the Jabbok River, and he's ready to cross there. And he sends messengers to Esau, and that say he's back in the land. Hey, Esau, I'm back. So he sends out messengers to tell Esau about this. Sometimes there are issues in our lives that hang around for a long time, and that's the way it was with Jacob. And some say that Jacob lived with Laban for 20 years. Others say it was 40 years before he returned home. And even though all this time has passed, he's still going to have to work it out. He's still going to have to resolve it. And sometimes we try to avoid issues, and you can't avoid it. If you don't resolve it, you're going to be confronted and have to resolve it somewhere down the line. I know that just a personal experience, we happened to work with an individual that was difficult to work with. And it was so bad that we thought of moving. I thought of anyway. I don't know whether my wife did, but it was bad. So we thought of moving. We don't need this. This is nothing but grief. And we thought of it, okay, that would be the easy way out. But then thinking about it more fully, and we weren't thinking of Jacob at the time, but we thought if we avoid this now, we're going to have to face it later. So we stayed, and it eventually resolved itself, not perfectly, but where it was livable for a time, and eventually we got relief from it. But we were better off staying and dealing with it and resolving it than moving away, because eventually you're going to come back and you're going to have to face it again in some way. And that's how it tends to be for us, and it's exactly what was happening here with Jacob. Jacob had left at his father's request, but he was going to have to come back and resolve the issue. And he was going to have to resolve it with the help of God, because he knew his brother was bitter toward him, and he was going to have to seek God's wisdom in dealing with it. So he sends messengers to Esau, and Esau in Mount Seir had established his own nation, and the burning question at this point was Jacob going to do things his own way, or was he going to trust God? That's the question that had to be answered. Was Jacob going to resolve this the way he saw fit, or was he going to trust God? So when you think about this, how many Christians do this? They know God, they know of God and his ways, and they take on some of God's characteristics, but they're not wholly and completely with it. And that's where Jacob was at. He was sort of a Christian, but he was not fully committed to following God and doing things God's way. So God expects us to become completely converted, not to just give lip service to God and his true teachings. It's talking about mind and heart and one's entire life. So Jacob knew he was not where he should be in this respect. He knew of the God of Abraham and Isaac who spoke to him, but God also knew that Jacob did not have the heart and mind of God. And God was the only one Jacob had ever known. But it's like he had grown up in a household where somebody worshiped the true God, but he wasn't Jacob's God. He's my grandfather's God. He's my dad's God. He's not my God. He did not have a personal relationship with him. And Jacob, as far as recognition, knew that there were many gods around, but he did agree that the God of his dad and his grandfather was the true God. So he knew the truth, but was he living it? Was he committed to it? That was the question that God wanted to find out. It was crunch time. And basically, Jacob is in a vice grip here, and he has no place to go but to resolve it. And as far as Jacob knew, Esau still wanted to kill him. He didn't know any difference. Yeah, so he figured that Esau would kill him. He would take his wives, his children, his possessions. He would lose everything, including his own life. And so as we think about this situation, there are issues in our own lives that sometimes come down to this. And they don't go away easily. So let's go to Genesis 32, verse 6. Then the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." Oh, that's good news. I'm sure they're armed and ready for battle. Verses 7 and 8. So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two companies. And he said, "If Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left will escape." So Jacob's worried about the whole situation, and he knows his brother lives by the sword, so he divides everything into two equal companies. Verse 9 recounts God's instruction to return to the land. It says, "Then Jacob said, 'O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your family, and I will deal well with you.'" That's what God told him. But did Jacob have total confidence that this was what was going to work out? Was he going to believe God or not? And look at the attitude that we see in Jacob here in chapter 32, verse 10. It's a much different attitude than we saw in Jacob when he left to go to the land of Haran. It says, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies of all the truth which you have shown your servant. I am not worthy. It's a completely different mindset than the individual who said, God said I should get the birthright. I should get the blessing. I deserve it because I'm so special. And it's a different mindset. He says, for I have crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me. He says, God, deliver me. Because he knew I can't deliver myself from this situation. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mother with my children. He knew he could not resolve this himself. He didn't have 400 armed men to take on Esau. He only had God to rely upon. So he knows that he's dependent on God to come through this in a positive way. Verse 12, for you said, I will surely treat you well, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So he quotes to God what God promised. Nothing wrong with that. That's what you promised. And that's nothing wrong with reminding him of the contract that they had made. So he asked God to deliver him, and we see this is quite a change from the past way that he was. It's quite a change in perspective from the Jacob who left Canaan. So he says, please intervene, please spare me, please watch over me, and I pray that you will give me the promises that you gave me earlier. And it poses a question for all of us as we go through life. Will we do what God says, or will our greatest fear stop us? Will we say, I know that God will see me through. I know that God will bless me in what I do. If I trust him and I do what he asked me to do, he will work it out for me. He will work it out for me. It may not be what I want. It may not be when I want, but God will work it out for me. So, before we get to Jacob's actual wrestling match, let's consider some frank and forthright discussions with men who walked with God. The great men of the Bible had some very frank and forthright discussions with God. They addressed God directly. They came boldly to the throne of heaven. And they had a relationship with God that is sometimes hard for us to believe. They had these discussions, but they came at God from a position of awe and respect and reverence. And in the end, they had some surprises. God didn't always answer it the way they thought they would. God's going to work it out the way I want it, and that's not always the way God operates. For instance, Job was asking questions that his three supposed friends could not answer. Consider some of the statements that Job made. Nobody can know what God is doing. I have been righteous, and yet I'm suffering. Where is wisdom anyway? There is no justice. I am being treated unjustly, God. And I want my day in court where I can present my case. And if I present my case, you're going to judge that you've been wrong in the way you've been dealing with me. And another thought that Job had, none of you can know why things are the way they are, because God doesn't tell us. God did not tell Job. Job did not have the whole picture. We look at Job and we can get a bird's eye view, and Job never had that perspective. And after Job had his say, what did God say to him? God just zapped him out of existence because Job made some very bold statements. So when God spoke to Job, he began asking him a lot of questions. And basically, he asked, why do you talk when you don't know what you're talking about? Why are you opening your mouth when you don't know what you're talking about? He told him, where were you when I created the earth? You seem to know all of this. Where were you when I brought the earth into creation? You seem to know all the answers. Do you know the first thing about death? Speak up. Tell me about death. What do you know about it? Do you presume to tell me what I'm doing wrong? Do you know where light comes from? Where does darkness lives? And Job didn't have any answers for any of these things. And so Job began to see God whittles him down, and Job gets smaller. He was the incredible shrinking Job, and he gets smaller and smaller as God confronts him because he realizes, oops, maybe I went a little too far with speaking to God. And we find that Job was honest with God in what he said. That's how he felt. And he said it respectfully. He was able to stay engaged with God even when he was off base. And even when we don't have all the answers and we're wrong, we still need to be able to engage God. We need to go to him and express our love and be honest with him. This is what's on my mind. This is how I feel in this circumstance. And God will speak to us through his word. God will help us to see things from his perspective. So we need to be looking for God being honest with us. We need to be honest with God. And, so we need to speak to him directly. And don't just be nice to God. There are things sometimes that are hard for us to deal with, and we must go to God and talk to him about them. One of the reasons we don't get down to real issues with God is why is it that we don't get down to the real issues? Well, it's because we're afraid of what God might tell us. If you really confront God and talk to him about your situation and what you think should be done or what you need, and you ask God for his will to be done, then you're opening up something that maybe you don't want to happen. Because what is God's will? It may be not what you're expecting. Or we might, as we speak to him and let your will be done, we might not be ready for what he's going to ask of us or what he's going to tell us. We may not be ready for it. Because if we're honest with God and we come from that approach, then God is going to be honest with us. So look at the Psalms, what we see there in regard to David and God. David said to God, why have you forsaken me? Why do you stand afar off, God? Why do you hide in times of trouble? Why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? Don't you understand that if you don't intervene right now, I am going to be dead? My enemies are going to take my life. So David was honest to God. He was honest with God. And he could have that kind of relationship, and that's the kind of relationship God wants to have with us. So the Psalms reveal God's answers to the questions that were posed. God answers David, and he will answer us as well. So this brings us to the wrestling match. Remember, Jacob is the supplanter, and he could grab the heel and trip up the person that he was wrestling with, and that was the approach to life that Jacob had. So God said, let's wrestle. So he came and he said, let's wrestle. And we find out later that this is not just an ordinary man who shows up and wants to wrestle with him. It was God who came in the form of a man. God called an angel in the book of Hosea, but the Logos is God's messenger, hence the angel is an apt title for the one we know as Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ comes in the form of a man, and as he came in the time of Abraham, and he's going to wrestle with Jacob. And he's going to wrestle with him because he wants to find out something very important about this man. So The match has come to typify our wrestling with our own spiritual issues. Times when we may be asking the hard questions of God, and Jacob was doing that, and he has a surprise coming. So God meets Jacob when he's alone. Everybody else is gone. They've already crossed over the river, so Jacob's there, and he's going to wrestle. And it says the man wrestled with Jacob, and we speak of wrestling with God, and what does that mean? Well, there's a point that God wants us all to come to in our lives. And that point is where we come before God with the hard questions, and we're willing to receive God's answer. We're willing to listen to God. And Jacob was at this point willing to listen to God and listen to what his input was. And so he meets God, met Jacob, and that's the way he deals with you and me as well. So some of us are still at the river Jabbok, going no further because we have met God and retreated. We're only going so far. And God says, you can't stay there. You got to move forward, and you're going to have to engage me just as Jacob had to. God brought Jacob to that point, and we all have to be brought to that point where we're going to wrestle with God as well. So with Jacob, here's the thing that he dreaded, and that was Esau. And he's worried about this, doesn't have a resolution to it, and so he wants God to work this out. So God comes to him, and they meet face to face, and they enter into this wrestling match. And it's something that we all have to go through in our lives. And so as they wrestle, what happens? They're wrestling, and Jacob encountered God in the very point in which he was strong, contending with men. He was contending with God here, taking them by the heel. And his life had been a constant struggle, and he was often successful with his adversaries. He had always won. And when the man with whom he wrestled saw that he could not prevail over Jacob, Jacob, being true to his character, hangs on and struggles while life remains. And what happens? The man that Jacob's wrestling with touches the socket of his thigh and renders Jacob powerless to do anything. Now, the old Jacob, what would he have done? He would have said, no mas. He would have quit. But Jacob is a pretty tenacious individual. By this point, I'm going to hang on. I'm not going to let this man go. So he's disabled by one touch. He can't even stand on his own, and he learns by experience that he's helpful. And the one that he's wrestling with is mightier than he is. And this is the turning point in what is a strange drama. The man says, let me go because dawn is coming. It's almost dawn. And Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. And he's still holding on, but he knows he's in the hands of a much higher power, a power who is able to disable or enable, to curse or to bless. But he knows now he's utterly helpless without healing or the protecting power of the one who's conquered him. He realizes even if he dies, he will still hold on. He's not going to let him go until he receives the blessing. So Jacob's sense of utter defeat is now the secret of his power with this friendly vanquisher. He realized that he had no power and he had to completely depend upon God, and he was willing to submit to God. Realize I have no power apart from God. So it's at this point that Jacob has a surprise. The man asked him, what is your name? Did he not know? He knew what his name was. And Jacob tells him Jacob. And then the man says, your name shall no longer be Jacob. And he changes his name at that point to Israel. A new name, Israel, which literally means prince with God or prevailer with God. And then Jacob asked this man that he was wrestling with, and he says, tell me your name. And what does God reply? What does God reply? He says, why are you asking my name? Why, the reason you came here was not to find out what my name is, but to find out who you are. And through this experience, you've gained insight into yourself. So when this exchange took place, then Jacob is blessed. So, and he named this place Peniel, which means that he had seen the face of God and he had lived. And you know, Jacob went on and he had a limp for the rest of his life. His hip was never healed. So he would always remember, where did this limp come from? So every step he had to limp. Every step he had to limp, and it was a reminder of what he went through. He would never forget it. So is wrestling with God only for Jacob? Is seeing God's face-to-face only for Jacob? Or is it for you and me? Is it for you and me? And it is important, as we see God face-to-face, to ask God some questions. And we need to ask him the right questions. Who am I? Where am I at? Where do I need to grow? Am I totally submitted to you? Let's look at something that we might think about in this regard in the book of Psalms. Psalm 24, verse 6. Psalm 24, verse 6. Psalm 24, verse 6. It says, "This is Jacob, the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face." As you think about this verse, what is David talking about? He's talking about the incident that we've just discussed, where Jacob wrestles with God. The generation of those who seek him, that is the race of those who seek him, this is their character. The character of individuals who seek God face to face. The generation who seeks God's character, his favor, they're God's true friends. That seek your face, O God, your face, O Jacob. And this is the race of Jacob. And who's Jacob? Who is Israel? Well, as you think about it, the name of Jacob was changed to Israel. And these are the ones who were sincere, who saw the face of God. And that's what we're to be, those kind of people who seek God face to face. This isn't just something that takes place in the Bible and is an interesting incident. It's describing how we're to interact with God face to face. And God may wrestle with us. Let's go to Romans chapter 9, verse 6. Who really are God's people? Romans chapter 9, verse 6. Final scripture. And I'm going to read from the Amplified Bible. Verse 6 says, "However, it is not as though God's word had failed, coming to nothing. For it is not everybody who is a descendant of Jacob, Israel, who belongs to the true Israel." So you have people that are physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they're not the true Israel, because they're flesh and blood. And being a part of the true Israel isn't about being flesh and blood. It's about being called. It's about allowing God to work in our lives as his called out ones. Verse 7 says, "And they are not children of Abraham, because they are by blood his descendants. No, the promise was, your descendants will be called and counted through the line of Isaac, through Abraham, though Abraham had an elder son, Ishmael. That is to say, it is not the children of the body of Abraham who are made God's children, but it is the offspring to whom the promise applies that shall be counted as descendants." We are those descendants, not because we are blood relations to Abraham, but because God called us out, and by faith we become his descendants. And we must face God. We must go to God and face him face to face. We must, where we need to, wrestle with God and seek the answers that only he can give us. So we all face challenges. They may not be as difficult as worrying about whether you're going to live or die, facing your brother who's pretty angry with you, but we all face those challenges. And as we go to God and wrestle with him face to face, ask him the hard questions, and we listen, then God will reply to us. And God will help us to prevail with him. And God will work in our lives to prepare us to be a part of his kingdom. As you look at Jacob, when he started out, he was an unconverted man. And he went through this whole process to end up as a converted man. He was unconverted, became converted. And as you think about, if you look at Jacob's reply to Pharaoh when he went to Egypt, the Pharaoh said, ask him about his life. And what did Jacob say? He said, it's been a long and hard road. And it was. And it was long and hard because he was a supplanter. And he was shrewd. And he conducted himself in a way that made his life hard. But he learned that's not the way. And the way is not to work things out for myself, but to trust God. So, just as God worked with Jacob, God is working with you and me.